Wyoming Territory, February 1889. The wind howled like a wounded animal across the desolate prairie, driving snow horizontal through the darkness. Inside a crumbling cabin that barely qualified as shelter, Elizabeth Carter pressed her back against the door, fighting to keep the bitter cold from seeping through every crack and crevice. Her 7 children huddled together on the single remaining blanket, their faces gaunt with hunger, their eyes too large in their thin faces. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The last of their meager food supplies had run out 3 days ago. The storm had been raging for a week, trapping them in their failing homestead with no way to reach help. Elizabeth's hands trembled as she counted the remaining pieces of bark. Tea she'd been brewing to stave off their hunger pangs. 2 small pieces left, maybe enough for 1 more day if she was careful. Somewhere in the white void beyond their walls, a different kind of man sat in a warm ranch house, staring into his own fire. Marcus Sullivan had built his empire through careful calculation and ruthless business sense, but tonight something gnawed at him, an inexplicable restlessness that had been growing stronger with each passing hour of the storm. He'd lived alone on his vast ranch for 15 years, trusting no one, needing no one. Yet tonight, for reasons he couldn't explain, he felt compelled to venture into the deadly blizzard. As Elizabeth's youngest child whimpered in his sleep, and Marcus Sullivan saddled his strongest horse against all logic and reason, fate was already weaving their paths together through the howling darkness. Neither could have imagined how this night would change not just their lives, but the lives of 7 children who had almost given up hope. The morning Elizabeth Carter's husband died, she'd been hanging laundry on the line behind their small homestead, watching their 7 children play in the yard. Daniel had been chopping wood for winter, his strong arms swinging the axe in the steady rhythm she'd grown to love over their 12 years of marriage. The children's laughter mixed with the sound of his work, creating the symphony of their simple but happy life. Then came the sickening crack of wood splitting wrong, followed by Daniel's sharp cry of pain. Elizabeth dropped the wet sheet she'd been hanging and ran toward the sound, but she was too late. The axe had glanced off a knot in the wood and buried itself deep in his leg, severing something vital. By the time she reached him, his face was already pale with shock, blood pooling in the dirt beneath him. "Lizzie," he whispered, using the pet name that always made her smile. "Get the children inside." She tried to stop the bleeding with strips torn from her apron, but they both knew it was too severe. The nearest doctor was 30 miles away in Casper, and with their 1 horse lame, there was no way to get him there in time. Daniel Carter died that afternoon while his 7 children waited in the cabin, not understanding why their mothers. Sobs could be heard through the thin walls. The children ranged in age from 16-year-old Robert down to 4-year-old Lucy. Robert had his father's tall frame and serious demeanor, already showing signs of the man he would become. Sarah, 14, possessed a quiet strength that reminded Elizabeth of her own mother. The twins, Michael and Matthew, were 12 and full of the restless energy that had constantly kept their parents on their toes. 10-year-old Emma had inherited Elizabeth's green eyes and stubborn streak. 8-year-old James was the dreamer of the family, always lost in books when he could find them. And Lucy, sweet Lucy, with her golden curls and infectious giggle, had been the light of Daniel's life. Now Elizabeth faced the impossible task of raising them alone on a homestead that had barely supported them when Daniel was alive. His mining work had provided the small income they needed to supplement what they could grow and raise. Without that income, Elizabeth knew she would have to make impossible choices. But she was determined to keep her family together, no matter what it cost her. The first months after Daniel's death were a blur of desperate activity. Elizabeth took in sewing when she could find it, trading needlework for flour and beans from the general store in town. Robert tried to take on his father's role, working odd jobs for neighboring ranches when the weather permitted. Sarah helped manage the household and the younger children with a maturity beyond her years. But despite their efforts, Elizabeth watched their meager savings dwindle week by week. Winter arrived early that year, catching them unprepared. The few vegetables Elizabeth had managed to preserve wouldn't last until spring, and their small supply of preserved meat was already running low by Christmas. She began watering down their soup, stretching every grain of rice, every bean, every scrap of flour, until the meals became little more than flavored water. The children never complained, though Elizabeth could see the hunger in their eyes. They grew quieter as the weeks passed, conserving energy they didn't have. Robert's clothes hung loose on his frame, and Emma's cheeks lost their rosy fullness. Even Lucy, usually bursting with energy, began spending more time curled up with whoever would hold her, seeking warmth and comfort they could barely provide. Elizabeth herself grew thinner, giving the larger portions to her children while pretending she wasn't hungry. At night, when they were all asleep, she would sit by the dying fire and calculate and recalculate their dwindling supplies, trying to find a solution that didn't exist. She could sell the homestead, but who would buy a failing farm in the dead of winter? She could take the children to town and throw herself on the mercy of the church, but the thought of breaking up her family, of admitting defeat, felt like betraying Daniel's memory. The storm that would change everything began building on a Tuesday in February. Elizabeth felt it in her bones before she saw the first clouds gathering on the horizon. The air grew heavy and still, with that peculiar quality that preceded the worst blizzards. She spent the day gathering what little firewood they had left, bringing it inside where it would stay dry. The children helped without being asked, their young faces serious as they sensed their mother's urgency. "Is it going to be a bad one, Mama?" Lucy asked, clinging to Elizabeth's skirts as the wind began to pick up. "Just a winter storm, sweetheart," Elizabeth replied, smoothing her daughter's golden hair. "We'll be cozy inside together." But even as she spoke the reassuring words, Elizabeth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. Their food supplies were critically low, barely enough for 2 more days if she stretched them as far as possible. The firewood wouldn't last much longer either, and without heat, they wouldn't survive more than a few hours in the brutal cold that was coming. She gathered the children together that evening as the first snowflakes began to fall. "We're going to play a special game," she told them, forcing brightness into her voice. "We're going to see how long we can make our food last, like we're pioneers exploring new territory." The older children understood immediately what she was really saying, but they played along for the sake of the younger ones. They made a ceremony of dividing their meager dinner into tiny portions, each child gravely accepting their small share, as if it were a feast. Elizabeth watched them and felt her heart breaking, even as pride swelled in her chest. Her children were brave, braver than she had any right to expect. By the 3rd day of the storm, the game had stopped being fun. The children were listless, moving slowly to conserve energy. Lucy cried more frequently, though she tried to muffle her sobs so as not to worry the others. Elizabeth had given up pretending to eat, claiming she felt sick so the children would accept her portions without argument. The wind screamed around their small cabin with relentless fury, driving snow through every gap in the walls, despite Robert's attempts to stuff rags into the cracks. The temperature inside the cabin hovered just above freezing, their breath visible in small puffs as they huddled together under every blanket and piece of clothing they owned. "Tell us about the farm Papa wanted to buy," Emma whispered through chattering teeth nestled between Sarah and the twins. Elizabeth closed her eyes, remembering Daniel's dreams. He had talked endlessly about the perfect piece of land he'd seen once, with rich soil and a clear stream running through it. It had, Apple trees, she began, her voice soft and distant. Rows and rows of them, heavy with fruit every fall. Papa said we could make pies and preserves, enough to last all winter. And a real barn, James added, having heard the story many times. Big enough for horses and cows and chickens, with a loft for hay, Michael continued, where we could play. When it rained, Matthew finished. Elizabeth nodded, pulling Lucy closer as the little girl shivered violently. Papa said the kitchen would have a big stone fireplace, warm enough to heat the whole house, and windows with real glass, not just oiled paper like we have here. As she spoke, Elizabeth realized these might be the last stories she would tell her children. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and they had no food left at all. She had been melting snow for water, but even that was becoming difficult, as their fire burned lower and lower. Soon they would have neither food nor warmth, and then she pushed the thought away, focusing instead on the feeling of her children pressed close around her. Whatever happened, they would face it together. She had promised Daniel she would take care of them, and she would keep that promise until her last breath. Miles away, in a ranch house that could have sheltered 50 people comfortably, Marcus Sullivan paced restlessly before his own roaring fire. He had everything a man could want, thousands of acres of prime grazing land, herds of cattle that made him one of the wealthiest men in Wyoming territory, a house built to withstand any storm. Yet tonight, surrounded by luxury and warmth, he felt more alone than he had in years. Marcus had built his empire through shrewd deals and an unwavering focus on profit. He trusted no one, relied on no one, and expected nothing from others except what he paid for. His ranch hands respected him but kept their distance, knowing better than to expect friendship from a man who viewed every relationship as a potential business transaction. He had no family, wanted no family, and had convinced himself long ago that solitude was not just preferable, but necessary for a man in his position. So why, he wondered, did he feel this strange compulsion to venture out into the storm? It made no logical sense. His cattle were safely sheltered, his buildings secure, his supplies more than adequate. There was no business reason to leave the safety of his home, and Marcus Sullivan never did anything without a business reason. Yet the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing hour. It was as if something was calling to him from out there in the howling darkness, something that needed his help. The very idea was ridiculous. Marcus Sullivan helped no one except himself, and everyone in the territory knew it. He was respected for his success, feared for his ruthlessness, but never loved, never needed for anything beyond what his money could buy. He stood at his window, staring out into the white void where nothing should be able to survive. His best horse, Thunder, was a massive black stallion bred for endurance and strength. If any horse could make it through this storm, it would be Thunder. But where would he go? What was he even looking for? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The rational part of his mind told him to pour another whiskey and settle in for the night. The storm would pass eventually, and whatever poor souls were caught in it would either survive or they wouldn't. It wasn't his problem, wasn't his responsibility. He had learned long ago that caring about others only led to disappointment and betrayal, but the feeling wouldn't leave him alone. It gnawed at him like hunger, like thirst, like some essential need that couldn't be ignored. Finally, unable to stand it any longer, Marcus pulled on his heaviest coat and headed for the barn. He would saddle Thunder and ride out into the storm, not because it made sense, but because something deeper than logic was driving him forward. As he struggled through the knee-deep snow to reach the barn, Marcus didn't know that 8 people were huddled together in a failing cabin not 10 miles from his ranch, their lives hanging by the thinnest of threads. He didn't know that his restless feeling would soon make perfect sense, or that this night would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself and what really mattered in life. The wind howled around him as he saddled Thunder. And for the first time in 15 years, Marcus Sullivan was about to discover that some things were more important than business. The decision to venture into the storm came to Marcus Sullivan like a physical blow. One moment he was standing in his warm barn, questioning his sanity, and the next he was cinching Thunder's saddle with hands that moved of their own accord. The massive stallion seemed to sense the urgency, stamping and snorting, but not fighting the bit, as Marcus led him out into the howling darkness. The cold hit him like a wall of knives. Even through his heavy coat and layers of wool, the wind found every gap, every weakness in his defenses. Snow stung his eyes and filled his nostrils, making each breath a conscious effort. Thunder's hooves crunched through the deepening drifts as they left the shelter of the barn. And within moments, Marcus could no longer see his own ranch house behind them. He had no destination in mind, only an overwhelming sense that he needed to head northeast, toward the cluster of small homesteads that dotted the territory beyond. His property line. Marcus had bought out most of those failing farms over the years, adding their acreage to his growing empire. The families had taken his money and moved on to try their luck elsewhere, leaving behind empty cabins that gradually succumbed to wind and weather. But not all of them had sold. A few stubborn homesteaders had refused his offers, clinging to their marginal lands with the desperate tenacity of people who had nowhere else to go. Marcus had dismissed them as fools, too proud or too stupid to recognize a fair deal when they saw one. Now, riding through the storm with ice forming on his beard, he found himself wondering if any of those holdouts were still alive. Thunder's breathing came in great puffs of steam that were immediately whipped away by the wind. The horse was strong, bred for endurance, but even he was struggling against the storm's fury. Marcus had to trust the animal's instincts now, letting Thunder pick his way carefully through the treacherous drifts while he squinted ahead for any sign of human habitation. The first cabin they encountered was nothing but a collapsed ruin. Its roof caved in under the weight of accumulated snow. Marcus felt a pang of something that might have been regret as he recognized the remains of the Henderson place. Old Pete Henderson had held out longer than most, insisting his mineral rights were worth more than Marcus was offering. The stubborn fool had died the previous spring, and his widow had finally accepted Marcus's offer for a fraction of what her husband might have gotten years earlier. The second homestead was in better condition, but clearly abandoned. The windows were boarded up, and no smoke rose from the chimney. Marcus urged Thunder past it, following some internal compass that seemed to pull him deeper into the storm. His hands were numb despite his thick gloves, and ice had formed on Thunder's mane. But still they pressed on. It was Thunder who found the Carter place, his ears pricking forward as he caught some sound that Marcus couldn't hear over the wind. The horse turned without guidance, following a fence line that was barely visible under the snow. Through the swirling white, Marcus caught a glimpse of dim light, so faint it might have been his imagination. But as they drew closer, the light resolved into the weak glow of a dying fire visible through a crack in wooden shutters. Smoke rose from a makeshift chimney, though so little that Marcus almost missed it in the storm. This was it, he realized with sudden certainty. This was what had been calling to him through the night. Inside the cabin, Elizabeth Carter felt death approaching like a slow, inexorable tide. The fire had burned down to barely glowing embers, and their last piece of furniture, an old wooden chair that had belonged to Daniel's mother, was now reduced to splinters and ash. The children lay motionless under every scrap of fabric they owned, their breathing shallow and labored. Lucy had stopped crying hours ago, which frightened Elizabeth more than the tears had. The little girl lay curled against her mother's chest, her skin cold and waxy to the touch. The older children had drawn into themselves, conserving what little energy remained. Even Robert, who had tried so hard to be the man of the family, lay with his eyes closed, his lips blue with cold. Elizabeth herself drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind playing tricks on her as hypothermia set in. She imagined she heard Daniel's voice calling her name, felt his strong arms reaching for her through the darkness. Part of her wanted to let go, to sink into that warm oblivion where there would be no more hunger, no more cold, no more impossible responsibility. But every time she began to slip away, one of the children would stir or whimper, and the sound would pull her back to wakefulness. She was their mother. She was all they had left. As long as there was breath in her body, she would fight for them. The sound, when it came, was so faint that Elizabeth thought it was another hallucination, a rhythmic thumping like hoofbeats in snow. But the sound grew louder, more insistent, until even the children began to stir. "Mama," Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "Do you hear that?" Elizabeth struggled to sit up, her body protesting every movement. The sound was real, definitely real. Someone was outside their cabin, fighting through the storm just as they were fighting to survive. Marcus dismounted from Thunder with legs that felt like wooden posts. The cold had seeped so deep into his bones that he could barely feel his feet. But he forced himself forward, following the faint light to what he hoped was a door. His fists pounded against the wooden barrier, the sound muffled by his thick gloves. "Hello!" he shouted, though the wind tore the words from his lips. "Is anyone in there?" Inside, Elizabeth heard the voice like a prayer answered. She tried to call back, but her throat was so dry and damaged from breathing the frigid air that only a croak emerged. Instead, she forced herself to crawl across the frozen floor to the door, her movements clumsy and painful. "We're here," she managed to rasp, loud enough for Marcus to hear. "Please, help us." The desperation in that voice hit Marcus like a physical blow. Without hesitation, he threw his shoulder against the door, which was stuck fast by ice and warped wood. It took 3 attempts before the barrier gave way, sending him stumbling into the cabin's dim interior. What he saw there would haunt him for the rest of his life. 8 people huddled together in the corner, their faces gaunt with starvation, their lips blue with cold. The woman who had spoken looked up at him with eyes that held a mixture of hope and disbelief. Around her, 7 children ranging from nearly adult to barely more than a baby, pressed close together under a pathetic collection of rags and torn blankets. The cabin itself was barely habitable. Wind whistled through gaps in the walls where the chinking had fallen out. The roof sagged ominously under the weight of snow, and the floor was slick with ice where melted snow had seeped through. The walls had refrozen. The fireplace held nothing but cold ashes, and Marcus could see no food anywhere in the single room. "Dear God," he breathed, the words torn from him without conscious thought. Elizabeth tried to speak again, but her voice failed her. Instead, she gestured weakly toward the children, her meaning clear. "Help them, save them. Whatever it costs, save my children." Marcus had built his fortune by making quick decisions, and he made one now. These people were dying, would be dead within hours if he did nothing. Thunder was strong enough to carry them, but not all at once, and not in this storm. They needed immediate warmth and food, neither of which he could provide here. "I'm taking you to my ranch," he said, his voice cutting through the wind that still howled through the open door. "All of you, right now." He moved to the closest child, the little blonde girl who lay so still he feared she was already gone. But when he touched her, she stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open to look at him with confusion and wonder. "It's all right, sweetheart," he said, surprised by the gentleness in his own voice. "You're safe now." What followed was the most challenging rescue of Marcus's life. Thunder, magnificent beast that he was, could carry perhaps 3 of the smaller children at once, but that meant multiple trips through the storm. The older boy, Robert, was too weak to walk, but too large to carry easily. The mother was conscious, but barely functional, her movements sluggish and uncoordinated. Marcus made the hardest decision of his life. He gathered the 4 youngest children first, bundling them together in his own heavy coat and lifting them onto Thunder's broad back. The horse stood steady as a rock despite the wind and snow, understanding. Somehow that precious cargo depended on his sure-footedness. "I'll be back," Marcus promised Elizabeth, looking into her eyes with an intensity that cut through her hypothermic confusion. "Do not give up. Do you hear me? I'll be back for all of you." The ride to his ranch with the first group of children was a nightmare of white wind and numbing cold. Marcus walked alongside Thunder, one hand on the horse's bridle, the other steadying the bundle of small bodies on the saddle. The children were so weak they could barely hold on, and Marcus found himself talking to them constantly, his voice fighting the wind as he told them about the warm house waiting for them, the food and hot drinks and soft beds. When they finally reached his ranch, Marcus's housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, met them at the door with eyes wide with shock. The elderly Chinese woman had worked for Marcus for 10 years, maintaining his household with quiet efficiency and asking no questions about his solitary lifestyle. But the sight of her employer carrying 4 half-frozen children into the house galvanized her into immediate action. "Hot baths," Marcus ordered, his own teeth chattering. "Food, warm milk, whatever you can manage quickly, and get fires going in the guest bedrooms. I have to go back." Mrs. Chen nodded without question, already reaching for the smallest child, the golden-haired little girl who reminded Marcus of a china doll. As he handed Lucy over to the housekeeper's gentle care, the child's eyes opened briefly, and she smiled at him, a tiny expression of trust that hit him harder than any business deal ever had. The second trip was even more harrowing. Marcus returned to find Elizabeth trying to keep the remaining children conscious, talking to them in a voice that was barely audible, but filled with desperate love. The twins, Michael and Matthew, were so weak they could barely lift their heads. Emma had developed a frightening cough that sounded like it was tearing her apart from the inside. James seemed lost in some inner world, his eyes unfocused and strange. This time, Marcus loaded the twins and Emma onto Thunder, then helped Robert climb up behind them, despite the older boy's protests that he could walk. Robert was nearly Marcus's height, but weighed barely more than the younger children, his body wasted by months of inadequate nutrition. "Watch over your brother and sisters," Marcus told him, seeing a spark of determination kindle in the boy's eyes. "You're almost home." Elizabeth and Sarah came on the 3rd trip, with James held between them on Thunder's back. By this time, the storm was beginning to show signs of weakening, though snow still fell heavily and the wind remained vicious. Elizabeth kept slipping in and out of consciousness, but every time she began to fade, Sarah would speak to her, keeping her mother anchored to the world of the living through sheer force of will. When they finally reached the ranch house, Marcus found his orderly world transformed into something resembling a small hospital. Mrs. Chen had enlisted help from the ranch hands who lived in the bunkhouse, and together they had prepared rooms, heated water, and begun the delicate process of warming and feeding people who were on the very edge of starvation. Marcus carried Elizabeth into the house, feeling how light she was, how fragile, this woman who had somehow kept 7 children alive through an impossible ordeal. As he laid her gently on the sofa near the fireplace, her eyes opened and focused on his face. "My children," she whispered, the words barely audible. "Safe," Marcus assured her, brushing a strand of dark hair from her forehead. "All safe, all here." For the first time since he'd found them, Elizabeth Carter smiled. Then consciousness left her, and she slept the deep sleep of someone who had finally, after so long, allowed herself to trust that her burdens could be shared. Marcus stood in his transformed house, listening to the sounds of children being cared for, of life returning to bodies that had been so close to death. Mrs. Chen moved efficiently between rooms, directing the ranch hands with quiet authority. Somewhere upstairs, he could hear Lucy's laugh, weak but genuine, as someone helped her into a warm bath. He had rescued 8 people tonight, brought them into his carefully ordered world, without thought for the consequences. Marcus Sullivan, who had spent 15 years building walls around his heart, who trusted no one and needed no one, suddenly found himself responsible for a family. The strangest part was that it felt right. For the first time in years, his house felt like a home. The news of the Sullivan Ranch's dramatic transformation spread through the Wyoming territory like wildfire carried on the spring wind. Word traveled from ranch hand to shopkeeper, from church pew to general store, gathering embellishments and raising eyebrows with each telling. Marcus Sullivan, the territory's most notorious bachelor and shrewd businessman, had taken in a widow and her 7 children. The very idea was so contrary to everything people knew about the man that many refused to believe it at first. Dr. Benjamin Hayes was among the first outsiders to witness the truth for himself. The elderly physician had been making house calls in the territory for 30 years, and he prided himself on understanding human nature. But what he found at the Sullivan Ranch challenged every assumption he had made about its owner. The doctor arrived on a crisp morning 2 weeks after the rescue, expecting to find a temporary arrangement born of Christian duty and destined to end as soon as alternative accommodations could be found. Instead, he discovered a household in the midst of joyful chaos. Children's voices echoed through rooms that had been silent for decades. Toys appeared in corners where previously only expensive but cold, decorative objects had stood. The scent of fresh-baked bread wafted from a kitchen that was clearly being used for more than just preparing solitary meals. "Well, I'll be damned," Dr. Hayes muttered under his breath as he watched Lucy Sullivan, for the children had naturally begun using Marcus's surname, chase a kitten through the hallway while her brothers cheered her on from the safety of the staircase. Mrs. Chen appeared at his elbow, her face serene despite the pandemonium around them. "The children are recovering remarkably well," she said in response to his unspoken question. "Their bodies are healing, but more importantly, their spirits are returning." The doctor's examination of each child confirmed Mrs. Chen's assessment. Robert had gained 15 pounds and was developing the broad shoulders of a young man who spent his days doing meaningful physical work. Sarah's complexion had lost the grey pallor of malnutrition, and her eyes sparkled with an intelligence that was finally free to flourish. The twins had grown taller and stronger, their boundless energy now channeled into productive activities rather than simply surviving each day. Emma's persistent cough had disappeared entirely, replaced by a sweet singing voice that often accompanied her as she helped with household tasks. James remained the dreamer of the family, but his dreams now had substance and possibility rather than serving as mere escape from harsh reality. And Lucy had blossomed into the bright, curious child she was meant to be, her laughter a constant source of joy throughout the house. But it was Elizabeth Carter who showed the most remarkable transformation. The hollow-eyed, desperate woman Dr. Hayes had briefly met during their crisis had been replaced by someone who radiated quiet strength and growing confidence. She moved through the house with purpose, clearly having found her place in its rhythms and routines. "Mrs. Carter," Dr. Hayes said as he completed his examinations, "I must say the improvement in all of you is quite extraordinary. This environment clearly agrees with your family." Elizabeth's smile was warm but carried a hint of uncertainty. "Mr. Sullivan has been incredibly generous, more generous than we have any right to expect." The doctor caught the subtle worry in her tone. "But it's just—" Elizabeth paused, choosing her words carefully. "This isn't our home, not really. We're guests here, welcome guests, but guests nonetheless." I can't help but wonder what will happen when Mr. Sullivan's natural inclination towards solitude reasserts itself. Her concerns were not unfounded. While Marcus had thrown himself into providing for the family's needs, he remained somewhat distant from their daily interactions. He would appear at mealtimes, making polite conversation and ensuring everyone had what they required, but he rarely lingered. The children adored him, but they sensed his reserve and responded by being slightly formal in his presence, as if afraid that too much familiarity might somehow jeopardize their security. The situation came to a head 3 weeks after the rescue, when a letter arrived that would test the fragile stability they had all begun to take for granted. The postmark was from Minnesota, and Elizabeth's hands trembled as she recognized her sister's handwriting. Margaret had written from Minneapolis, where she lived with her husband and 3 children in comfortable circumstances. The letter was kind but firm in its message. Elizabeth and her children were welcome to come stay with them until Elizabeth could get back on her feet. Margaret's husband owned a successful dry goods store and had connections that could help Elizabeth find employment. It was a generous offer and a practical one. But as Elizabeth read the letter aloud to her children that evening, she could see the dismay in their faces. This house had become their sanctuary, their place of healing and growth. The thought of leaving it, of returning to a life of uncertainty and dependence, filled them all with dread. "We don't have to go, do we, Mama?" Lucy asked, crawling into Elizabeth's lap with the unconscious assumption that she would be welcomed there. "Your Aunt Margaret is being very kind," Elizabeth said carefully. "She wants to help us." "But we're already being helped," Robert protested. "Mr. Sullivan said we could stay as long as we needed to, and I'm learning so much about ranching. He says I have a natural talent for working with cattle. And I've been helping Mrs. Chen preserve fruits and vegetables for winter," Sarah added. "She's teaching me recipes her grandmother used in China. I never knew there were so many different ways to prepare food." Marcus, who had been standing quietly in the doorway, stepped into the room. "Is there something troubling you, Mrs. Carter?" Elizabeth looked up at him. This man who had saved her family and asked for nothing in return. She held out the letter with a hand that wasn't quite steady. "My sister has invited us to come stay with her family in Minneapolis. She thinks it might be more appropriate than our current arrangement." Marcus read the letter in silence, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts. When he finished, he folded it carefully and handed it back to Elizabeth. "What do you think would be best for your family?" It was the question Elizabeth had been dreading, because she knew the answer in her heart, but wasn't sure she had the right to voice it. "I think," she said slowly, "that my children have found something here they've never had before. Stability, purpose, the chance to grow into who they're meant to be." "And what about you?" Marcus asked quietly. Elizabeth felt color rise in her cheeks. The truth was that she too had found something here, something she hadn't expected and wasn't sure she deserved. A sense of partnership, of shared purpose, of being valued not just as a mother, but as a woman with her own thoughts and capabilities. "I've found peace here," she admitted. "For the first time since Daniel died, I've found peace." The silence that followed was broken by Lucy's small voice. "Mr. Marcus, don't you want us to stay?" Marcus knelt down so he was at eye level with the little girl. "Lucy, I want you and your family to be happy and safe. If you think you'd be happier in Minneapolis, we'd be sadder," Lucy said, with the devastating honesty of childhood. "Way, way sadder. And you'd be sadder too, I think." Out of the mouths of babes. Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of fears he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. "You know what, Lucy? I think you're absolutely right." He stood and faced Elizabeth directly. "Mrs. Carter, I have a proposition for you. Not charity, not temporary shelter, but a real partnership." Elizabeth's heart began to beat faster. "What kind of partnership?" This ranch needs a manager for the household operations, someone to oversee the domestic staff, handle the accounts. For supplies and provisions, coordinate with the neighboring ranches for social obligations. The position would come with a generous salary and permanent residence for your entire family. Elizabeth stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. Mr. Sullivan, are you offering me employment? I'm offering you a role that plays to your strengths while giving your family the security they deserve, Marcus replied. You've already proven yourself capable of managing a household under the most difficult circumstances. With proper resources and support, you could turn this place into something truly special. Robert stepped forward, his young face serious. And what about us, sir? The younger ones? Marcus smiled, and for the first time since they'd known him, the expression reached his eyes completely. Robert, you've shown remarkable aptitude for ranch work. I'd like to train you properly, with the understanding that you'd have a permanent position here if you want it when you're older. As for your siblings, there's a school in town, but we could also arrange for tutoring here at the ranch. Sarah's already proving invaluable in the kitchen, and the twins have shown real interest in the mechanical aspects of ranch operations. And me, Emma asked shyly, you, young lady, have a gift for an organization that would make any business owner envious. I've watched you reorganize the library and coordinate your siblings' activities. Those are valuable skills. What about Lucy? James asked, ever protective of his baby sister. Marcus knelt down again and lifted Lucy into his arms. Lucy gets to be a little girl. She gets to play and learn and grow up surrounded by people who love her. That's the most important job of all. Elizabeth felt tears threatening to spill over. This wasn't charity or temporary kindness. It was a real offer of partnership, of building something together. Mr. Sullivan, we accept. With gratitude, and the promise that we'll work hard to justify your faith in us. The celebration that followed was unlike anything the house had ever seen. The children's joy was infectious, and even Mrs. Chen allowed herself a rare smile as she watched the family she had helped nurse back to health claim their permanent place in the household. But the real test of their new arrangement came the next day when the first visitors arrived to see for themselves what changes had overtaken the Sullivan Ranch. Mrs. Adelaide Worthington, the self-appointed social arbiter of the territory, arrived in her finest carriage with her two unmarried daughters in tow. She had clearly come expecting to find scandal, or at least impropriety. Instead, she found Elizabeth Carter efficiently managing a household that ran like clockwork while maintaining an atmosphere of warmth and welcome. The children were well-dressed, well-mannered, and obviously thriving. Marcus Sullivan, far from appearing compromised by his unusual living situation, seemed more at ease and confident than Mrs. Worthington had ever seen him. Mrs. Carter, Adelaide said with barely concealed surprise, I must say, you've certainly made quite an impact here. The children and I are very grateful for Mr. Sullivan's kindness, Elizabeth replied diplomatically. We're doing our best to prove worthy of his trust. Over the course of the afternoon, as more neighbors arrived to satisfy their curiosity, a pattern emerged. Those who came expecting to find something scandalous or inappropriate instead discovered a household that functioned better than most. Traditional families. The children were happy and productive. Elizabeth was clearly thriving in her new role, and Marcus appeared more human and approachable than he had in years. By evening, when the last visitor had departed, the general consensus was that Marcus Sullivan had somehow managed to acquire not just a housekeeper and her children, but a ready-made family that complemented his solitary nature perfectly. Well, Elizabeth said as she and Marcus stood on the porch, watching the children play in the yard, I think we've passed our first social test. Marcus chuckled, a sound that was becoming more frequent. Mrs. Worthington looked positively disappointed that she couldn't find anything to gossip about. "Give her time," Elizabeth said with a laugh. "I'm sure she'll think of something." As they stood together in comfortable silence, both realized that they had successfully navigated their first major challenge as a partnership. The children were secure, the community was accepting their unusual arrangement, and they had found a way to blend their individual strengths into something stronger than either could have achieved alone. The foundation they had built was proving to be solid indeed. But just as they settled into their new routines, winter began its retreat, and with the melting snow came unexpected complications. The first challenge arose when a representative from the territorial government arrived to conduct the annual census. Mr. Jeremiah Blackwood was a thin, officious man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a perpetual frown who took his duties very seriously indeed. "Mr. Sullivan," Blackwood said, consulting his clipboard with bureaucratic precision, "I need to verify the residence of this household for official records. The reports I've received are somewhat confusing." Marcus invited the man into his study, where Elizabeth joined them at his request. She had learned to handle the ranch's correspondence and financial records with remarkable efficiency, and Marcus had come to value her input on all matters affecting the household. "Let me see if I understand correctly," Blackwood continued, adjusting his spectacles. "You, Mr. Sullivan, are listed as the head of household, but residing here we also have Mrs. Elizabeth Carter and her 7 minor children. The relationship is listed as household manager and dependents." "That's correct," Marcus replied calmly. Blackwood's frown deepened. "Mr. Sullivan, I must point out that such arrangements are highly irregular. An unmarried man cohabitating with a widow and her children raises certain questions about propriety." Elizabeth felt her cheeks burn, but Marcus's voice remained steady. "Mr. Blackwood, Mrs. Carter is my employee. She manages the domestic operations of this ranch with the same professionalism that my foreman manages the cattle operations. Her children reside here as part of her compensation package." "Nevertheless," Blackwood persisted, "the territorial government prefers arrangements that conform to accepted social standards. Have you considered the possibility of marriage? It would legitimize the situation considerably." The silence that followed was deafening. Elizabeth felt as though the floor had dropped out from beneath her, while Marcus's jaw tightened visibly. The suggestion hung in the air between them like smoke from a poorly tended fire. "Mr. Blackwood," Marcus said finally, his voice dangerously quiet, "I'll thank you to confine your inquiries to matters of census data rather than personal recommendations." The census taker departed soon after, but his words had planted seeds of doubt that neither Elizabeth nor Marcus knew how to address. They went about their daily routines with a new awkwardness, suddenly hyper-aware of how their arrangement might appear to others. The second challenge came from an entirely different direction. Robert, now 17 and growing stronger each day, had attracted the attention of other ranchers in the territory. His natural ability with horses and cattle, combined with Marcus's excellent training, had made him something of a local legend among the ranch hands. "Mr. Sullivan," Robert said one evening as they finished the day's work in the barn, "Mr. Patterson from the Double Creek Ranch has offered me a position. He says I could be his head wrangler within 2 years, with my own cabin and a substantial salary." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. He had grown genuinely fond of the serious young man, and the thought of losing him was more painful than he cared to admit. But he also knew that Robert deserved every opportunity to build his own future. "It's a generous offer," Marcus said carefully. "Patterson runs a good operation." "Yes, sir, it is generous," Robert replied. "But I wanted to talk to you about it first. This family owes you everything, and I wouldn't want to seem ungrateful by leaving." "Robert, you don't owe me anything. I gave your family a home because I wanted to, not because I expected anything in return. The young man studied Marcus's face in the lamplight. "But that's just it, sir. This isn't just about debt or gratitude anymore. This feels like home, like family. And I can't help but notice that you and Mama, well, there's something there. Isn't there?" Marcus nearly dropped the bridle he was cleaning. "Robert, I think you're misunderstanding." "Am I?" Robert stepped closer, his young face serious. "I see how you look at her, sir, and how she looks at you when she thinks no one's watching. You care about each other, maybe more than either of you wants to admit." Before Marcus could respond, Robert continued, "Mr. Patterson's offer got me thinking about the future, about what happens to all of us, not just me. The younger children are settling in well, but they need stability, real stability, not just the kindness of a generous employer." Marcus set down the bridle and faced Robert directly. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that maybe Mr. Blackwood wasn't entirely wrong, even if he was rude about it. Maybe you and Mama should consider marriage, not for appearances or to satisfy busybodies, but because you've already become a family in every way that matters." The conversation was interrupted by Sarah's voice calling from the house, announcing that dinner was ready. But Robert's words echoed in Marcus's mind throughout the evening meal, as he watched Elizabeth efficiently manage the controlled chaos of feeding 7 children while maintaining easy conversation with everyone at the table. She had transformed his house into a home, filled empty rooms with laughter and purpose, brought life to spaces that had been monuments to his solitude. More than that, she had somehow reached past the walls he had built around his heart and reminded him what it felt like to be part of something larger than himself. After the children were settled for the night, Marcus found Elizabeth in the kitchen, reviewing the household accounts by lamplight. She looked up as he entered, her smile warm but tinged with the same awkwardness that had plagued them since Blackwood's visit. "The numbers look good," she said, indicating the ledger. "We're actually saving money compared to your previous household expenses, despite feeding 8 additional people." "Elizabeth," Marcus said, pulling out a chair beside her, "we need to talk about what Blackwood said today." Her hands stilled on the pages. "Marcus, if our arrangement is causing you problems, that's not what I mean." He reached out and covered her hands with his own, surprised by how natural the gesture felt. "I mean the part about marriage." Elizabeth's breath caught. "You don't have to feel obligated because some officious little man thinks—" "I'm not feeling obligated," Marcus interrupted gently. "I'm feeling something I never expected to feel again. Elizabeth, these past weeks with you and the children, it's been the happiest time of my life." She turned her hands palm up, lacing her fingers with his. "Mine too," she whispered. "But Daniel will always be the children's father, and I would never try to replace him in their hearts," Marcus said. "But Elizabeth, is there room in your heart for something new, for us?" Before she could answer, Lucy's voice drifted down from upstairs, calling for her mother. Elizabeth started to rise, but Marcus gently held her back. "I'll go," he said softly. "Think about what I've said. We don't need to decide anything tonight." As Marcus climbed the stairs to comfort the little girl who had somehow wound herself around his heart, Elizabeth sat alone in the kitchen, her mind spinning with possibilities she had never dared to consider. The accounts lay forgotten before her as she contemplated a future that suddenly seemed full of promise rather than mere survival. The morning brought news that would force decisions none of them were quite ready to make. A telegram arrived from Elizabeth's sister Margaret, announcing that she and her family would be arriving within the week to assess the situation and possibly take Elizabeth and the children back to Minneapolis. The household received this news with varying degrees of alarm. The children were openly distressed at the thought of being evaluated like merchandise, while Mrs. Chen muttered disapprovingly in Mandarin as she attacked her bread-making with unusual vigor. "She means well," Elizabeth said, though her own voice lacked conviction. Margaret has always felt responsible for me since our parents died. She's going to try to take you away, Lucy said with the devastating clarity of childhood. I can tell. Marcus gathered the family in the main parlor, his expression serious but determined. Whatever happens when your aunt arrives, I want you all to know that this is your home for as long as you want it to be. No one will force you to leave if you don't want to go. But what if she says we have to? Emma asked, voicing the fear. They all shared. Then we'll have to convince her that staying is what's best for everyone, Marcus replied, including me. Elizabeth felt her heart flutter at the implication in his words. Marcus, Elizabeth, I know this isn't the most romantic setting, he said, suddenly dropping to one knee before her chair while the children watched in amazement. But I can't let your sister take you away without telling you how I feel. I love you. I love all of you. Will you marry me? Will you make this family official in the eyes of God and the territorial government? The silence that followed was broken by Lucy's delighted gasp. Mama, say yes! Say yes! Elizabeth looked around at her children's hopeful faces, then at the man kneeling before her with his heart in his eyes. Daniel would want her to be happy, she realized. He would want their children to have a father who loved them as much as Marcus clearly did. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes, Marcus Sullivan, I will marry you. The chaos that erupted was joyful and deafening. Children cheered. Mrs. Chen appeared from nowhere with tears in her eyes, and even thunder seemed to whinny approvingly. From the barn, Margaret Carter Hartwell could arrive whenever she liked. She would find not a desperate widow in need of rescue, but a woman surrounded by love and building a future with a man who valued her for exactly who she was. The foundation was solid, the walls were rising, and soon they would have a roof over their happiness that no storm could tear away. Spring arrived at the Sullivan Ranch with an explosion of color and possibility that seemed to mirror the transformation taking place within its borders. The harsh Wyoming winter that had nearly claimed 8 lives was giving way to meadows dotted with wildflowers and streams running clear with snowmelt. But the most remarkable changes were happening not in the landscape, but in the people who called the ranch home. Elizabeth stood at the kitchen window watching Robert work with a young horse in the training corral. At 17 now, her eldest son had grown into his father's height and developed the confident bearing of someone who knew his worth and place in the world. Marcus worked beside him, offering guidance with the patience of a man who understood that true skill could not be rushed. The bond between them had grown beyond that of employer and employee, evolving into something closer to father and son, though neither would have presumed to use such terms aloud. That boy has magic in his hands with horses, Mrs. Chen observed, joining Elizabeth at the window. Mr. Sullivan says he's never seen anyone learn so quickly. Elizabeth smiled, pride evident in her expression. His father would be amazed. Daniel was good with animals, but Robert has surpassed anything I ever imagined. The kitchen around them hummed with efficient activity. Sarah, now 15 and blossomed into a young woman of remarkable capability, directed the preparation of the evening meal with the skill of someone twice her age. She had taken to the culinary arts with passion, combining Mrs. Chen's traditional recipes with techniques learned from cookbooks Marcus had ordered from Denver. The result was a cuisine, uniquely their own, drawing from multiple traditions to create something entirely new. The Denver merchants want to place a standing order for Sarah's preserves, Elizabeth continued, watching her daughter carefully adjust the seasoning in a large pot of stew. They say they've never tasted anything quite like her spiced pear. Butter. It was true. What had begun as Sarah's interest in helping Mrs. Chen had evolved into a small but profitable business venture. Marcus had encouraged her to experiment with fruit preservation techniques, and the results had attracted attention throughout the territory. Orders now came in regularly from as far away as Cheyenne, providing Sarah with her own source of income, and the confidence that came with recognized expertise. The twins, Michael and Matthew, burst through the kitchen door with the boundless energy of 14-year-olds who had spent the day learning to repair mechanical equipment. Their faces were streaked with grease, and their clothes bore evidence of their afternoon working with the ranch's new, steam-powered threshing machine. "Mama, you should see what we accomplished today," Michael exclaimed, his eyes bright with excitement. "We figured out why the thresher was jamming and fixed it without having to send for parts from town. Mr. Sullivan says we have natural mechanical minds," Matthew added proudly. "He's thinking about sending us to Denver next year to study with a real engineer." Elizabeth felt her heart swell with possibilities she had never dared imagine for her sons. In their old life, the twins would have been lucky to find work as farmhands or laborers. Here, their talents were recognized and nurtured, their futures limited only by their own ambitions and willingness to work. Emma appeared in the doorway, her arms full of account books and her expression serious beyond her 12 years. She had become Elizabeth's unofficial assistant in managing the household finances, demonstrating an aptitude for numbers that consistently amazed the adults around her. "Mama, I've finished reconciling the supply orders for next month," she announced. "We're under budget by $15, and I found an error in the feed merchant's billing that saved us another $8. "What would we do without you?" Elizabeth asked, smoothing her daughter's hair. Emma beamed at the praise, but Elizabeth could see the weight of responsibility in her young eyes. Sometimes she worried that Emma was growing up too quickly, taking on adult concerns before she had fully experienced childhood. As if reading her mother's thoughts, Emma's serious expression suddenly broke into a grin. "James is in the library reading poetry to Lucy again. She's pretending to understand it, but she fell asleep 20 minutes ago." The image of her son carefully reading verses to his sleeping baby sister filled Elizabeth with warmth. James, now 10, had found his element in Marcus's extensive library. He devoured books with the hunger of someone long denied intellectual nourishment, and his teachers in town had declared him ready for studies well beyond his age level. But it was his gentle nature with Lucy that revealed the depth of his character. "Speaking of Lucy," Sarah said, looking up from her cooking, "did you know she's been teaching Thunder to recognize different voice commands? Mr. Sullivan is convinced she'll be training horses before she's 10. 6-year-old Lucy had indeed formed an extraordinary bond with Marcus's prized stallion. The massive horse, who had once allowed only Marcus to handle him, now responded to the little girl's calls with the docility of a lapdog. It was a development that both amazed and slightly concerned the adults, though Lucy's fearless confidence around all the ranch animals suggested a natural gift that shouldn't be discouraged. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew everyone's attention to the window. A rider was approaching the main house, moving with the urgent pace that suggested important news. Elizabeth recognized him as Tom Morrison, one of the hands from the neighboring Fletcher Ranch. Marcus and Robert had seen him coming and met him at the fence line. Even from a distance, Elizabeth could see the tension in their postures as they listened to whatever message Tom had brought. After a few minutes of intense conversation, Marcus shook the young man's hand and sent him on his way before walking quickly toward the house. "Mrs. Carter," he said as he entered the kitchen, his expression serious but not alarmed, "I need to speak with you privately." Elizabeth followed him to his study, her mind racing through possibilities. In the months they had lived at the ranch, Marcus had always included her in any decisions that affected the household. His formal tone suggested something significant was brewing. "What is it?" she asked as soon as the door closed behind them. Marcus moved to his desk but didn't sit, instead leaning against it with the casual posture that had become familiar to her. "Tom brought word from town. There's been a development regarding your old homestead. Elizabeth felt her stomach tighten. She had tried not to think about the cabin where they had nearly died, had assumed it was simply another abandoned claim, reverting to the territory. The land agent has received an inquiry about purchasing the property, Marcus continued. Apparently, there's been some geological surveying done in that area, and they've found indications of valuable mineral deposits. The implications hit Elizabeth immediately. The mineral rights, they belong to Daniel's estate, which means they belong to you and the children, Marcus confirmed. If the surveys prove accurate, you could be looking at a substantial sum of money. Elizabeth sank into the chair across from his desk, her mind reeling. How substantial? Enough to make you independently wealthy, enough to give you options you've never had before. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken questions. Elizabeth stared at her hands, trying to process this unexpected turn of events. Financial independence had been a distant dream for so long that she could barely imagine what it would mean in practical terms. Elizabeth, Marcus said quietly, using her first name as he had begun to do in private moments. This changes things. She looked up at him, seeing uncertainty in his expression for the first time since she'd known him. How? You wouldn't need to work as my household manager anymore. You could afford to live anywhere, do anything. Your children could attend the finest schools, have opportunities I could never provide. Elizabeth heard the careful neutrality in his voice and recognized it for what it was. Fear. Fear that this windfall would take her and the children away from the life they had built together. Is that what you think I want? She asked softly. Marcus straightened, his businessman's mask slipping back into place. I think you should consider all your options. You've given so much to this place, to making it work. You deserve the chance to choose your own path without feeling obligated by gratitude or circumstance. Elizabeth stood and walked to the window, overlooking the yard where her children were gathering for the evening meal. Robert was washing his hands at the pump, while Sarah called the younger ones in from their various activities. They moved with the easy familiarity of people who knew exactly where they belonged. Marcus, she said, still facing the window, do you want us to leave? The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. When she turned to face him, she saw that his careful composure had cracked, revealing the vulnerability beneath. God, no, he said, his voice rough with emotion. These months with you and the children have been the happiest of my life. This house was just a building before you came. Now it's a home. Elizabeth felt something shift in her chest, a recognition of feelings that had been growing steadily, but which she had been afraid to examine too closely. Then why are you so determined to give me reasons to leave? Marcus ran a hand through his hair. A gesture she had learned indicated internal struggle. Because I want you to stay for the right reasons, not because you feel indebted to me or because you think you have no other choice. If you're going to build a life here, it should be because it's what you truly want. The honesty in his words, the care they revealed for her autonomy and happiness, touched something deep in Elizabeth's heart. She had been loved by a good man, once had experienced the security and joy of a true partnership. She had thought such a thing could never happen twice in one lifetime. What if, she said carefully, what I want is to invest that money in this ranch, to become a true partner in building something lasting. Marcus stared at her, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. Elizabeth, are you saying... I'm saying that my children and I have found our home. We've found our family. Money can provide security, but it can't create what we have here. The smile that spread across Marcus's face was like sunrise after a long night. Are you sure? Once you commit to this life, to this place, there's no going back to the way things were. Elizabeth laughed, a sound full of joy and certainty. Marcus Sullivan, I haven't wanted to go back for months. I want to go forward, with you, with all of us together. The conversation that followed laid the groundwork for a partnership that went far beyond employer and employee, far beyond benefactor and grateful recipient. They talked about expansion plans for the ranch, educational opportunities for the children, and the possibility of transforming their arrangement into something even more permanent and meaningful. As evening fell and the family gathered for dinner, Elizabeth looked around the table at the faces of her children and the man who had saved them all. They had traveled so far from that desperate night in the blizzard, had grown into something none of them could have imagined when survival was their only goal. The future stretched ahead of them, bright with possibility and anchored by the love they had discovered in the most unexpected circumstances. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but tonight they were exactly where they belonged, together, safe and home. The celebration of their decision took an unexpected turn when Lucy, who had been unusually quiet during dinner, suddenly stood on her chair and clapped her hands for attention. At 6 years old, she had developed a flair for the dramatic that both amused and occasionally exasperated her older siblings. "I have something important to say," she announced, with the gravity of someone making a state proclamation. The table fell silent, all eyes turning to the golden-haired little girl who had become the undisputed heart of their household. Even Marcus, who had initially been somewhat intimidated by the intensity of Lucy's affection, now waited with the same fond attention as the rest of the family. "Mr. Marcus," Lucy said, turning her bright blue eyes toward him, "you saved us from the snow, and you gave us a home, and you taught Robert about horses, and you let Sarah make her special jellies, and you bought James all those books, and you helped Emma with her numbers." She paused for breath, and Elizabeth found herself holding hers, wondering where this was leading. "But I think," Lucy continued with the devastating honesty of childhood, "you forgot to save yourself." The silence that followed was profound. Marcus stared at the little girl, his expression unreadable, while the rest of the family exchanged glances that spoke of sudden understanding. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Elizabeth asked gently. Lucy turned to her mother, then back to Marcus. "Before we came, he was all alone in this big house. That's like being lost in the snow too, except it's warm snow that you can't see, from the mouths of babes." Elizabeth felt tears prick her eyes as she realized the truth in her youngest daughter's observation. Marcus had rescued them from physical danger, but they had rescued him from something equally perilous, the slow death of the spirit that came from years of isolation and emotional winter. "Lucy's right," Robert said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of near adulthood. "Mr. Sullivan, you saved our lives that night, but I think we all saved each other." Marcus cleared his throat, clearly struggling with emotions he rarely allowed himself to show. "I never thought of it that way." "That's because you were too busy being noble and self-sacrificing," Sarah said with a smile that took any sting out of her words. "But Lucy sees things the rest of us miss sometimes." The conversation that followed was unlike any they had shared before. For the first time, Marcus spoke openly about the loneliness of his previous life, the way success and wealth had insulated him from genuine human connection. He talked about the night he had ridden into the storm, driven by an inexplicable compulsion that he now understood had been his heart calling out for exactly what he had found, a purpose beyond profit, a reason to care about something other than business. The children listened with the rapt attention they usually reserved for James's most exciting adventure stories. To them, Marcus had always been their rescuer, their protector, the man who had given them everything. The idea that they had given him something equally valuable in return was a revelation that seemed to both humble and empower them. "So what happens now?" Emma asked with her characteristic directness. I mean, with the mineral rights and everything changing. It was Elizabeth who answered, her voice strong with conviction. Now we build something extraordinary. Not just a ranch, not just a business, but a legacy. Something that proves families aren't just born, they're chosen and created by people who love each other enough to work for something bigger than themselves. Marcus reached across the table and took her hand, the gesture natural and right, in a way that surprised no one, least of all themselves. A legacy, he repeated thoughtfully. I like the sound of that. The weeks that followed their decision were a whirlwind of activity and planning. The mineral survey confirmed what the preliminary reports had suggested. The Carter homestead sat atop a significant silver deposit that would indeed provide substantial wealth for years to come. But rather than diminishing their commitment to the ranch, the windfall seemed to energize everyone's vision for what they could accomplish together. Elizabeth threw herself into the role of true partner with an enthusiasm that amazed even her. She had always been organized and capable, but the security of knowing she was building something permanent unleashed a creativity and ambition she hadn't known she possessed. Her plans for expanding the ranch's operations went far beyond anything Marcus had imagined on his own. What if we didn't just raise cattle? She proposed during one of their evening planning sessions. What if we created a model agricultural operation that other ranchers could learn from? Marcus looked up from the ledgers they had been reviewing, intrigued by the passion in her voice. What did you have in mind? Sarah's preservation business is already bringing in requests from merchants in 3 territories. The twins are developing mechanical innovations that could revolutionize how ranches operate. Robert's methods with horses are producing results that have other ranchers asking questions. She stood and moved to the large map of their combined properties that now covered one wall of Marcus's study. What if we established a training center? A place where young people could come to learn modern ranching techniques, where established ranchers could see new technologies in action. The scope of her vision took Marcus's breath away. Elizabeth, that would require enormous coordination, significant investment, which we now have, she reminded him with a smile. And more importantly, we have the human resources. Each of our children has developed expertise in different areas. We could create something that benefits not just our family, but the entire region. Marcus studied the map, seeing not just their current holdings, but the future Elizabeth was describing. Training facilities for horse handling, demonstration, plots for new agricultural techniques, workshops for mechanical innovations, perhaps even a school for rural children whose families couldn't afford to send them to distant cities for education. It would take years to implement, he said thoughtfully. We have years, Elizabeth replied, and we have each other. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the direction of the barn. Through the window, they could see lanterns moving in the darkness and hear voices calling urgently. Marcus was on his feet instantly, Elizabeth close behind him as they hurried outside. They found Robert and the twins working frantically over a mare who was clearly in distress. The horse, one of their most valuable breeding animals, was down and struggling, her breathing labored and her eyes wild with pain. She started having trouble about an hour ago, Robert reported tersely, never taking his eyes off the suffering animal. I've seen difficult births before, but this is something else. Marcus knelt beside the mare, his hands gentle but sure as he assessed the situation. Years of ranching had given him experience with veterinary crises, but this case was beyond his expertise. We need Dr. Morrison, he said grimly, but he's 60 miles away, and in this weather. I'll go, Robert said immediately. Absolutely not, Elizabeth said firmly. The roads are treacherous, and if something happened to you, then what do we do? Michael asked, his young face tight with worry. Just watch her suffer? It was Lucy who provided the answer, appearing at Elizabeth's elbow with the silent grace she had developed over months of observing ranch life. "Thunder could make it," she said quietly. Everyone turned to look at the little girl, who gazed back with the matter-of-fact confidence that had become her trademark. "Thunder's the strongest horse we have," she continued, "and he knows the way to town better than any of us. If someone really rode him, they could get to Dr. Morrison and back before." She didn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood. Before the mare died, either from her current distress or from complications that would arise without professional help. "Lucy's right about Thunder," Marcus said slowly, "but the rider would have to be experienced enough to handle him in difficult conditions, light enough not to tire him unnecessarily." His eyes met Robert's, and understanding passed between them. Robert was the obvious choice, experienced with horses, light enough for the long ride, and skilled enough to handle Thunder at speed in dangerous conditions. "I can do it," Robert said quietly. "I know I can." Elizabeth felt her heart clench with fear. She had already lost one husband to an accident that had seemed manageable until it wasn't. The thought of risking her eldest son on a dangerous night ride brought back all her old terrors. But as she looked at Robert's face, she saw not the boy, who had once been too weak to stand, but the young man he had become, capable, confident, and ready to take on adult responsibilities. This was what they had been building toward all along. The moment when her children were strong enough to face challenges rather than simply endure them. "Go," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her heart. "Bring Dr. Morrison back safely." The next several hours tested everyone's courage and resolve. Robert's departure on Thunder was both magnificent and terrifying to watch, the powerful stallion disappearing into the darkness with the fluid grace of a force of nature. The rest of the family maintained a vigil with the struggling mare, taking turns cooling her with wet cloths and offering what comfort they could. Sarah appeared with food and hot coffee, understanding instinctively that this crisis required sustained effort from everyone. The twins worked together to prepare a makeshift operating area in case Dr. Morrison needed it, while Emma kept careful notes on the mare's condition and the timeline of events. James read aloud from a veterinary manual Marcus had in his study, his young voice steady as he shared information that might prove useful. Elizabeth found herself working alongside Marcus with the seamless coordination they had developed over months of partnership. They didn't need to discuss who would do what. Each seemed to anticipate the other's needs and movements. It was a level of teamwork that spoke of deep understanding and mutual trust. "Whatever happens with the mare," Marcus said quietly during a brief respite, "I want you to know how proud I am of Robert, of all of them. They're handling this crisis like seasoned adults." Elizabeth looked around at her children, each contributing their unique skills to the emergency effort. "They've learned that from you," she said softly. "You've shown them that responsibility isn't a burden, it's a privilege." When Thunder's hoofbeats finally announced Robert's return with Dr. Morrison, the entire household had been transformed by their shared ordeal. They had faced a crisis together and discovered that their individual strengths, when combined, created something far more powerful than any of them could have achieved alone. Dr. Morrison's successful treatment of the mare was almost anticlimactic after the drama of the night. The horse would recover completely, and both mother and foal would be fine. But the real victory was what the family had learned about themselves and each other. As dawn broke over the ranch, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that seemed to promise new beginnings, Elizabeth stood with Marcus watching their children finally head inside for some well-deserved rest. "You know," Marcus said thoughtfully, "I think Lucy was right that first night. We all saved each other, but tonight proved something else." "What's that?" "We're ready to save others too. Your vision for the training center, for making this place something that benefits the whole community. Tonight showed me we have the foundation to make that dream real." Elizabeth smiled, feeling the truth of his words in her bones. They had started as strangers, thrown together by desperate circumstances. They had become a family through choice and dedication. Now they were ready to become something more, a force for positive change in their corner of the world. The morning light revealed not just a ranch, but the birthplace of a legacy that would touch countless lives in the years to come. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in early autumn, carried by a postal rider whose horse was lathered with sweat from hard travel. The official seal of the Wyoming territorial government marked it as correspondence of unusual importance, and Marcus felt a familiar tightness in his chest as he recognized the handwriting of Governor Francis Warren himself. Elizabeth found him in his study an hour later, the letter spread before him on his desk, his expression unreadable. She had learned to recognize the signs of Marcus wrestling with significant decisions, and the careful stillness of his posture told her this was one of those moments. "Bad news?" she asked, settling into the chair across from his desk that had become hers over the months of their partnership. "Complicated news," Marcus replied, sliding the letter across to her. "The governor wants to visit the ranch. Apparently, word of our innovations has reached the territorial capital." Elizabeth read quickly, her eyebrows rising as she absorbed the content. Governor Warren was requesting permission to bring a delegation of territorial officials and potential investors to observe their operations. The letter specifically mentioned their training programs, the success of Sarah's preservation business, and the mechanical innovations the twins had been developing. "This is wonderful," Elizabeth said, looking up from the letter with excitement. "Recognition from the territorial government could open doors we never imagined. Or it could bring scrutiny we're not prepared for," Marcus countered, though his tone suggested he was playing devil's advocate rather than expressing genuine concern. "Official attention isn't always beneficial, especially for arrangements like ours." Elizabeth understood his caution. Their unconventional family structure, while accepted by their local community, might not withstand examination by officials looking for reasons to find fault. A wealthy bachelor living with a widow and her 7 children, no matter how proper and beneficial the arrangement, could be viewed with suspicion by those inclined to see scandal where none existed. "When does he want to come?" she asked. 3 weeks from today. A full inspection tour, including meetings with all the children to discuss their various projects and innovations. Elizabeth felt a flutter of nervousness at the thought of her children being formally evaluated by territorial officials. They had grown confident and capable within the safe environment of the ranch, but this would be their first real test in the broader world. "We'll need to prepare thoroughly," she said, her mind already working through the logistics. Not just the facilities, but the children as well. They'll need to be able to articulate what they've learned and accomplished. Over the following days, the ranch transformed into a hive of focused activity. Elizabeth worked with each child to help them organize their thoughts and prepare presentations about their respective areas of expertise. Robert practiced explaining his horse training methods, complete with demonstrations of the gentling techniques he had developed. Sarah prepared samples of her preserves, along with detailed explanations of her preservation processes and business operations. The twins threw themselves into documenting their mechanical innovations, creating detailed drawings and written explanations of the improvements they had made to various ranch equipment. Emma organized financial records that demonstrated the ranch's profitability and growth under their management. James prepared a presentation about the educational opportunities available in their rural setting, including the extensive library and tutoring programs they had established. Even 6-year-old Lucy had a role to play, though her contribution was more instinctive than planned. Her extraordinary connection with the ranch's animals, particularly her ability to calm even the most spirited horses, had become legendary among the neighboring ranches. While she couldn't explain her gift in technical terms, her demonstrations spoke for themselves. Mrs. Chen, meanwhile, planned menus that would showcase both her traditional cooking skills and Sarah's innovative preservation techniques. The goal was to demonstrate that their household operated with the efficiency and sophistication of any establishment in the territory, while maintaining the warmth and genuine care that made it truly special. As the day of the visit approached, Elizabeth found herself experiencing a level of anxiety she hadn't felt since their earliest days at the ranch. So much had changed since that desperate night when Marcus had rescued them from the blizzard. They had built something beautiful and meaningful, but now it would be judged by outsiders who might not understand or appreciate what they had accomplished. "You're nervous," Marcus observed, as they stood together on the porch the evening before the governor's arrival. It wasn't a question. After months of partnership, he could read her moods as easily as she could read his. "Terrified," Elizabeth admitted. "What if they don't see what we see? What if they focus on the unconventional aspects of our arrangement, rather than the results we've achieved?" Marcus moved closer, his presence solid and reassuring beside her. "Elizabeth, what we've built here is extraordinary. The children are thriving. The ranch is more prosperous than it's ever been, and we've created something that benefits not just our family, but the entire community. If the governor and his delegation can't see that, the fault lies with them, not with us." His confidence helped steady her nerves, but Elizabeth still spent a restless night, imagining all the ways the visit could go wrong. When morning came, however, her children's excited energy proved infectious. They had worked hard to prepare for this day, and their pride in what they had accomplished was evident in every gesture and expression. Governor Warren arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, accompanied by a delegation that included the territorial secretary, 2 potential investors from Denver, and a journalist from the Cheyenne Daily Leader. Elizabeth had expected officials in formal suits, perhaps somewhat stiff and intimidating. Instead, she found herself greeting a group of genuinely curious individuals who seemed more interested in learning than in finding fault. "Mrs. Carter," Governor Warren said, as Marcus introduced them, "I must say, the reports we've received about your operations here have been quite remarkable. We are very interested to see these innovations for ourselves." The tour began with Robert's demonstration of his horse training techniques. Working with a young stallion that had been considered unmanageable by its previous owners, Robert displayed the patient, gentle methods he had developed under Marcus's guidance. The transformation of the horse from fearful aggression to calm cooperation took place before the visitors' eyes, eliciting murmurs of amazement and appreciation. "How long does this process typically take?" asked one of the Denver investors, clearly impressed by what he had witnessed. "It depends on the individual animal," Robert replied with the confidence of someone who knew his subject thoroughly. "Some horses respond within days, others require weeks of patient work. The key is understanding that fear and aggression usually stem from past trauma. Once you address the underlying cause rather than just the symptoms, lasting change becomes possible." Elizabeth felt a surge of pride as she watched her son field questions with the poise of someone twice his age. The metaphor inherent in his words wasn't lost on her either. The same principle that applied to traumatized horses had applied to their own family's healing process. Sarah's presentation in the kitchen drew equally enthusiastic responses. She had prepared a tasting menu that showcased her preservation techniques, from traditional fruit preserves to innovative vegetable combinations that extended the usefulness of seasonal crops. The business aspects of her operation were equally impressive, with detailed records showing steady growth in both local and distant markets. "Young lady," the journalist said as he sampled her spiced apple chutney, "this is restaurant quality. Have you considered expanding beyond preservation to other culinary ventures?" Sarah's eyes lit up at the suggestion. I've been experimenting with developing recipes that could be reproduced in other kitchens. Mrs. Chen has been teaching me about standardizing measurements and techniques so that others could achieve consistent results. The twins' mechanical innovations proved to be the highlight of the technical portion of the tour. Their improvements to ranch equipment had resulted in significant increases in efficiency and reductions in labor costs. More impressively, their modifications could be easily replicated by other operations, potentially benefiting ranchers throughout the territory. "Gentlemen," Governor Warren said as he examined their detailed drawings and specifications, "what you've accomplished here represents exactly the kind of innovation our territory needs to compete with more established regions. Have you considered pursuing formal engineering education?" Michael and Matthew exchanged glances before Michael answered for both of them. "Mr. Sullivan has been arranging for us to study with an engineer in Denver next year. We want to learn everything we can so we can come back and help make ranching more efficient for everyone in the territory." Emma's financial presentation was perhaps the most surprising element of the day for the visitors. Her clear grasp of complex business concepts and her systematic approach to managing the ranch's accounts impressed even the experienced investors in the group. "Miss Carter," the territorial secretary said, as he reviewed her meticulously organized ledgers, "your financial management skills would be valuable in any business enterprise. How did you develop such expertise at such a young age?" Emma's response revealed both her natural aptitude and the opportunities she had been given to develop it. "Mr. Sullivan and Mama have included me in business discussions since I showed interest. They've taught me that understanding money isn't just about arithmetic. It's about making decisions that create value for everyone involved." James's presentation about their educational initiatives opened the visitors' eyes to possibilities they hadn't considered. His articulate discussion of the curriculum they had developed, combining traditional academic subjects with practical, skills training, suggested a model that could be replicated in other rural areas throughout the territory. "The key," James explained with the earnestness of a natural teacher, "is recognizing that education should prepare people for the lives they're actually going to live. Books and formal learning are essential, but so are practical skills and the ability to solve real problems." Lucy's contribution to the day was less formal, but no less impressive. When one of the horses became agitated during the afternoon demonstrations, she simply walked over and placed her small hand on the animal's neck. The immediate calming effect was so dramatic that it left the visitors momentarily speechless. "How does she do that?" the journalist asked, his pen poised to capture the explanation. "We're not entirely sure," Marcus admitted with a smile. "Lucy seems to have an intuitive understanding of animal behavior that goes beyond anything we could teach. She simply knows what they need to feel safe." As the day progressed, Elizabeth watched the visitors' expressions change from polite interest to genuine amazement. These weren't just children who had been rescued and given opportunities. These were young people who had transformed those opportunities into genuine expertise and innovation. The formal dinner that evening provided an opportunity for more relaxed conversation. Governor Warren, in particular, seemed fascinated by the family's story and the unconventional path that had led to their current success. "Mrs. Carter," he said during a quiet moment between courses, "I hope you understand how remarkable what you've accomplished here truly is. When we first received reports about this operation, I'll admit I was skeptical. The idea of such young people achieving this level of expertise seemed implausible." Elizabeth glanced around the table at her children, engaged in animated discussions with the various members of the delegation about their respective areas of interest. "Governor Warren, I think what we've learned is that young people are capable of far more than most adults assume. They just need to be given real responsibilities and the support to rise to meet them." And that support, Marcus added, comes not just from adults, but from being part of a family unit where everyone's contributions are valued and everyone's growth is encouraged. The conversation continued late into the evening, covering topics that ranged from territorial development policy to innovative approaches to rural education. The visitors were clearly impressed, not just by what they had seen, but by the vision Elizabeth and Marcus had for expanding their model to benefit other communities throughout the territory. When the delegation finally departed the next morning, they left behind more than just compliments and promises to spread word of the ranch's innovations. Governor Warren had made a formal request for Elizabeth and Marcus to serve as consultants in developing territorial policies for rural education and agricultural development. "What do you think?" Marcus asked as they watched the last of the carriages disappear down the long drive. Elizabeth considered the question seriously. The opportunity to influence territorial policy was both exciting and daunting. It would mean travel, time away from the ranch, and the responsibility of ensuring that their successful model could be adapted to help other families and communities. "I think," she said finally, "that we'd be selfish to keep what we've learned to ourselves. If we can help other families find the same kind of hope and opportunity we've found, isn't that worth whatever challenges it might bring?" Marcus nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It would mean changes for all of us. More visibility, more responsibility, probably more scrutiny, but also more impact," Elizabeth countered. "More families like ours are finding ways to thrive instead of just surviving." As they walked back toward the house, where the children were already back to their various activities and projects, Elizabeth reflected on how far they had all come. From that desperate night in the blizzard to this moment of recognition and opportunity, their journey had been extraordinary. But perhaps more extraordinary still was the realization that this wasn't an ending, but a beginning. They had proven that love, dedication, and mutual support could overcome almost any obstacle. Now they have the chance to help others discover the same truth. The future stretched ahead of them, filled with possibilities they were only beginning to imagine. And whatever challenges it might bring, Elizabeth knew they would face them as they had faced everything else. Together, as a family bound not by blood alone, but by choice, commitment, and an unshakable belief in each other's potential. The weeks following the governor's visit brought a flurry of correspondence that transformed Marcus's study into something resembling a government office. Letters arrived daily from territorial officials, potential investors, educational institutions, and newspapers throughout the region. Each brought new opportunities, new challenges, and new decisions that would shape not just their family's future, but potentially the future of rural development throughout the Wyoming Territory. Elizabeth found herself spending hours each day, responding to inquiries and coordinating with various officials who wanted to implement aspects of their model in other communities. The process was both exhilarating and overwhelming, requiring skills she was still developing on the fly. "Mrs. Carter," came a familiar voice from the doorway. She looked up to find Dr. Hayes, who had become a regular visitor to the ranch, not just as a physician, but as someone genuinely interested in their educational innovations. "Doctor, what brings you out today?" Elizabeth asked, rising from the desk where she had been composing a response to the Territorial Education Commissioner. "Several things, actually," Dr. Hayes replied, settling into one of the comfortable chairs Marcus had added to accommodate their frequent meetings. "First, I wanted to check on how everyone is handling all this attention. Change, even positive change, can be stressful." Elizabeth appreciated his concern. The doctor had witnessed their family's journey from that first desperate night, and his perspective on their well-being carried weight that purely official inquiries could not. "The children are thriving on the attention," she said honestly. Robert especially has been energized by the recognition of his work with horses. He's been invited to demonstrate his techniques at 3 different ranches this month alone. And you, Dr. Hayes asked, with the directness that made him such an effective physician, how are you managing the transition from private citizen to public figure? The question struck deeper than Elizabeth had expected. The truth was that she sometimes felt like she was living someone else's life, making decisions that affected hundreds of people she had never met, being consulted on policies that would shape the territory's development for decades to come. It's challenging, she admitted. 6 months ago, my greatest concern was keeping my children fed and warm. Now I'm being asked to advise on territorial education policy. Sometimes I wonder if I'm qualified for such responsibility. Dr. Hayes smiled, the expression kind but knowing. Mrs. Carter, I've been practicing medicine for 30 years, and I've learned that the people most qualified for great responsibility are often those who question their own qualifications most seriously. Your family's success isn't an accident. It's the result of wisdom, dedication, and an understanding of human potential that most people never develop. Before Elizabeth could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention to the window. A rider was approaching at speed, his posture suggesting urgency rather than casual business. Elizabeth and Dr. Hayes moved to the porch to meet the visitor, who proved to be young Tom Morrison from the Fletcher Ranch. Mrs. Carter, Tom called out as he dismounted, I need your help. We've got a situation developing in town that requires your particular expertise. Elizabeth felt a familiar tightness in her chest. Emergency calls had become more frequent as word of their success spread, but each one still triggered memories of their own desperate period. What's the situation, she asked. The Hendricks family, Tom explained, his breathing still labored from his hard ride. You remember them? They had the small farm about 20 miles east of here, been struggling since old man Hendricks died last spring. Elizabeth nodded. She knew the family by reputation, a widow with 4 children, trying to maintain a failing farm with inadequate resources and no real support system. Mrs. Hendricks collapsed yesterday, Tom continued. Doctor says it's exhaustion and malnutrition. The children are in bad shape too. The church ladies are trying to help, but they're talking about splitting up the family, sending the children to different relatives in other territories. The parallels to their own story were unmistakable, and Elizabeth felt her heart clench with sympathy and determination. Where are they now? Still at the farm, but barely hanging on. Mrs. Hendricks is insisting she can manage, but anyone can see she can't. The oldest boy is maybe 14, and he's trying to hold everything together, but Elizabeth was already moving toward the house, her mind racing through possibilities. Dr. Hayes, would you be willing to make a house call? And Tom, can you wait long enough to guide us there? Within an hour, a small convoy was heading toward the Hendricks farm. Elizabeth and Dr. Hayes traveled in the ranch's wagon, loaded with food, medical supplies, and warm clothing. Marcus rode alongside them, having insisted on coming, despite Elizabeth's protests that the ranch needed his attention. Elizabeth, he had said with the quiet firmness she had learned to recognize, when you rescued me from my isolation, I learned that some things are more important than business. This is one of those things. Sarah had insisted on coming as well, bringing a selection of her preserves and dried foods that could provide immediate nutrition for a struggling family. The twins had loaded tools and equipment they thought might help with necessary repairs. Lucy had contributed, packing a bag of toys and books that might bring some comfort to children facing circumstances she herself remembered all too well. The Hendricks farm, when they reached it, was heartbreakingly familiar. The same air of desperate struggle, the same sense of a family fighting a losing battle against circumstances beyond their control. The children who emerged from the cabin to greet their visitors had the same hollow-eyed look Elizabeth's own children had worn during their darkest days. Mrs. Hendricks herself was barely conscious when Dr. Hayes examined her body depleted by months of giving her children what little food they had while denying her own needs. The situation was critical, but not yet hopeless. "We need to get her to proper care immediately," Dr. Hayes said quietly to Elizabeth and Marcus, "and these children need food, warmth, and stability if they're going to recover." Elizabeth looked around the failing farm, seeing not just the current crisis, but the potential for transformation. The land was good, the basic structures sound despite their current neglect. With proper support and resources, this could become a thriving operation again. "Marcus," she said quietly, "what if we implemented our first satellite operation here?" Marcus followed her gaze, understanding immediately what she was suggesting. Instead of simply rescuing the Hendricks family, as he had once rescued the Carters, they could create a support system that allowed the family to rebuild their own success story. "You mean establish a training program here?" he asked thoughtfully. "Exactly. Robert could teach the oldest boy proper land management and animal husbandry. Sarah could work with the mother and daughter on food preservation and potential income generation. The twins could help upgrade their equipment and facilities." The plan that emerged over the following hours was ambitious but practical. Mrs. Hendricks and her youngest child would come to the Sullivan Ranch for immediate medical care and recovery. The 3 older children would remain at their farm, with Robert and Sarah providing daily instruction and support. Marcus would provide the financial backing necessary for immediate improvements, with the understanding that the investment would be repaid from future profits. Most importantly, the family would remain together and maintain ownership of their land while receiving the support they needed to build a sustainable future. "Mrs. Carter," Dr. Hayes said as they prepared to transport Mrs. Hendricks back to the ranch, "what you're proposing goes far beyond simple charity. You're talking about creating a replicable model for community support and development." Elizabeth nodded, feeling the weight of the decision, but also the rightness of it. "Doctor, we've learned that survival isn't enough. People need the opportunity to thrive, to build something meaningful. If we can create a system that provides that opportunity systematically, we can change lives throughout the territory." The journey back to the ranch with Mrs. Hendricks and her youngest child marked the beginning of a new phase in their development. No longer were they simply a successful family unit. They were becoming the center of a network of support and opportunity that reached far beyond their own boundaries. Mrs. Chen met them at the door with the same quiet efficiency she had shown during their own family's crisis. Within hours, Mrs. Hendricks was receiving proper medical care while her 4-year-old daughter was being gently coaxed out of her fearful silence by Lucy's patient friendship. The older Hendricks children, meanwhile, were receiving their first lessons in the systematic approach to land management that had made the Sullivan Ranch so successful. Robert worked with 14-year-old David Hendricks, showing him how proper animal care could maximize the productivity of their small herd. Sarah taught 12-year-old Martha preservation techniques that could turn their garden surplus into year-round nutrition and potential income. "It's working," Marcus observed, as he and Elizabeth watched the various training sessions taking place around their property. "The model is actually working." Elizabeth smiled, feeling a deep satisfaction that went beyond personal success. "It's working because it's based on something real. We're not just giving them charity, we're giving them the tools to build their own success." The evening brought a letter that would prove to be a turning point in their expanding mission. Governor Warren had written to formally request their assistance in developing a territorial program based on their model. The proposal included funding for multiple satellite operations, formal recognition of their training programs, and the establishment of the Sullivan-Carter Institute for Rural Development. The Sullivan-Carter Institute, Elizabeth read aloud, testing the sound of the words. That has a nice ring to it. Marcus moved to stand beside her, looking out at the ranch that had become so much more than either of them had ever imagined. Elizabeth, are you ready for this? Once we commit to this level of involvement, there won't be any going back to the quiet life. Elizabeth thought about the question seriously. The quiet life had its appeal, certainly. The idea of focusing solely on their own family, of enjoying the security and prosperity they had built, was tempting. But then she thought about Mrs. Hendricks, slowly recovering her strength in the room upstairs. She thought about young David Hendricks, his eyes bright, with hope as Robert taught him techniques that could transform his family's prospects. She thought about all the other families throughout the territory who were struggling as they once had struggled, waiting for someone to show them that a different future was possible. Marcus, she said finally, 6 months ago, you asked me if I was ready to choose my own path without feeling obligated by gratitude or circumstance. Now, I'm choosing freely and completely. I want to build something that outlasts us, something that gives other families the same chance we've had. Marcus smiled, the expression full of love and admiration. Then we build it together, all of us. As if summoned by his words, the children began gathering on the porch, drawn by some instinct that told them an important moment was taking place. Robert came from the barn, still dusty from his work with the horses. Sarah emerged from the kitchen, flour on her apron from the bread she had been baking. The twins appeared from the workshop, where they had been designing improvements for the Hendricks farm equipment. Emma and James came from the study, where they had been working on correspondence for the various programs they were developing. And Lucy skipped up from the yard, where she had been playing with Martha Hendricks, both girls giggling with the pure joy of childhood friendship. "We have some news to share," Elizabeth announced, holding up the governor's letter. "We've been asked to establish a formal institute for rural development. It means we'll be helping families throughout the territory, teaching them the same things we've learned about building successful lives together." The children's reactions were immediate and enthusiastic. They had all been involved in helping the Hendricks family, and they understood intuitively that their work was making a real difference in people's lives. "Does this mean we'll have students coming here to learn?" Robert asked, his eyes bright with excitement. "It means," Marcus replied, "that we're going to become teachers as well as learners. Each of you has developed expertise that can help other young people build better futures for themselves and their families." As the family discussion continued into the evening, Elizabeth felt a deep sense of completion. They had come so far from that desperate night in the blizzard, had grown from survivors to creators of opportunity for others. The future they were building would touch lives they might never know, would ripple outward through generations in ways they could only begin to imagine. The quiet ranch had become the center of something much larger, something that would transform not just their own lives, but the lives of countless others who needed to know that hope, hard work, and mutual support could overcome almost any obstacle. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new families to help, new programs to develop. But tonight, surrounded by the family that had saved each other and was now ready to save others, Elizabeth Carter Sullivan felt the deep peace that comes from knowing you are exactly where you belong, doing exactly what you were meant to do. 5 years had passed since that first desperate night in the blizzard, and the Sullivan-Carter Institute for Rural Development had become a beacon of hope throughout the Wyoming Territory and beyond. What had begun as one family's struggle for survival had evolved into a comprehensive network of support, education, and opportunity that had transformed hundreds of lives. Elizabeth stood at the window of the Institute's new administrative building, watching the morning activities unfold across what had once been simply Marcus's ranch. Students from across the territory moved between various training facilities, the expanded horse training center, where Robert, now 22, and considered one of the finest horsemen in the region, worked with young people who had never imagined they could master such skills. The Culinary Arts building where Sarah, at 20, had established a program that taught both practical food preservation and small business development to women struggling to support their families. The mechanical workshop buzzed with activity, as Michael and Matthew, now 19 and already being recruited by engineering firms in Denver and Chicago, guided younger students through the process of designing and building equipment improvements that could revolutionize small-scale farming operations. Their innovations had been adopted by ranchers throughout the American West, and they had received inquiries from as far away as California and Texas. Emma, now 17, managed the Institute's complex financial operations with the expertise of someone twice her age. Her systematic approach to resource allocation and program evaluation had become a model studied by territorial officials and visiting educators from Eastern universities. She had developed accounting methods specifically designed for rural cooperative enterprises, and her manual on small-scale agricultural economics was being used in schools from Montana to Colorado. James, 15 and already accepted for early admission to the University of Colorado, split his time between advanced academic studies and developing curriculum for the Institute's educational programs. His innovative approach to combining practical skills training with traditional academic subjects had attracted attention from educational reformers throughout the country. Despite his academic opportunities, he had made it clear that his future lay in returning to expand the Institute's educational mission, and Lucy, now 11 and still possessing her extraordinary gift with animals, had become something of a legend. Ranchers brought their most difficult horses to her, and veterinarians from across the territory sought her insight into animal behavior problems that had defied conventional solutions. More importantly, she had begun teaching other children to develop their own intuitive understanding of animal communication, creating a new generation of young people who approached animal husbandry with unprecedented sensitivity and skill. The transformation extended far beyond the original Sullivan Ranch. The network now included 12 satellite operations throughout the territory, each one centered around a family that had been rescued from desperate circumstances and trained to become teachers and leaders in their own communities. The Hendricks farm had become the model for this expansion, with Mrs. Martha Hendricks now serving as the Institute's coordinator for family support services. Elizabeth's own role had evolved beyond anything she could have imagined during those dark months, when keeping her children alive had consumed every ounce of her energy. She now served as the Institute's Director of Community Development, a position that required her to travel throughout the territory, consulting with territorial officials, potential partner organizations, and families seeking to establish their own support networks. The work was demanding but deeply fulfilling. Each success story reinforced her belief that with proper support and opportunity, any family could overcome seemingly impossible circumstances. The letters that arrived daily from graduates of their programs, reporting new achievements and expanded opportunities, provided constant validation that their work was making a lasting difference. But perhaps the most meaningful transformation had occurred in her relationship with Marcus. What had begun as rescue and gratitude had evolved through partnership and mutual respect into something neither had expected. A love that was deeper and more complete than either had experienced before. They had been married for 2 years now, a quiet ceremony that had been attended by hundreds of families whose lives had been touched by their work. The wedding had taken place in the same barn where Marcus had once taught Robert to care for horses, with Lucy serving as flower girl and all the Institute's students and graduates forming an honor guard. Governor Warren himself had attended, along with territorial officials, neighboring ranchers, and representatives from universities and charitable organizations throughout the region. The ceremony had been simple but profound, with vows that spoke, not just of their commitment to each other, but to the shared mission they had built together. When Marcus had promised to love and support not just Elizabeth, but all the children they would help in the years to come, there hadn't been a dry eye in the assembled crowd. Now, as Elizabeth watched the bustling activity of another productive day at the Institute, she reflected on how completely their lives had been transformed. The frightened, desperate woman who had huddled with her children in a freezing cabin seemed like someone from another lifetime, though the memory remained vivid enough to fuel her passion for helping others facing similar circumstances. "Mrs. Sullivan," came a voice from behind her. She turned to find Martha Hendricks, whose own transformation from near starvation to confident program coordinator never failed to amaze Elizabeth. "The delegation from Colorado has arrived. They're particularly interested in seeing our family integration model in action." Elizabeth nodded, straightening her jacket as she prepared for another day of demonstrations and explanations. The constant stream of visitors sometimes felt overwhelming, but each one represented potential expansion of their mission, new opportunities to help families build better lives. The Colorado delegation proved to be especially engaged, asking detailed questions about everything from funding models to curriculum development. They were particularly impressed by the Institute's approach to keeping families together while providing intensive support and training. "Mrs. Sullivan," said Dr. Rebecca Adams, the delegation's leader and a professor of social reform at the University of Colorado, "what you've accomplished here challenges conventional wisdom about poverty and family stability. Most approaches involve separating families to address individual needs. Your model proves that families can be strengthened as units while still addressing specific challenges." Elizabeth smiled, thinking of all the families who had found hope and opportunity through their programs. "Dr. Adams, we learned from our own experience that survival is only the first step. What people really need is the chance to build something meaningful, to contribute to their communities, to see their children develop skills and confidence that will serve them throughout their lives." The tour continued through the various facilities, with each of Elizabeth's children taking turns, explaining their areas of expertise. The visitors were consistently amazed by the depth of knowledge and skill demonstrated by young people who had once been considered charity cases. Robert's work with a particularly challenging horse drew spontaneous applause from the delegation. The animal, which had been brought to the Institute after injuring 3 different trainers, responded to Robert's patient approach with remarkable cooperation. "How do you explain this transformation?" asked one of the visitors. "Every living thing responds to being understood and respected," Robert replied, with the quiet confidence that had become his trademark. "Whether we're working with horses or people, the principle is the same. You have to see past the fear and aggression to understand what's really needed." Sarah's demonstration of her preservation techniques and business development methods sparked detailed discussions about women's economic opportunities in rural communities. Her program had already helped dozens of women establish profitable, small businesses, creating economic stability that benefited entire families. "The key," Sarah explained to the fascinated visitors, "is recognizing that traditional women's skills, like food preservation and household management, are actually sophisticated business capabilities. Once you provide the framework for marketing and expansion, Women can build substantial enterprises. The twins' mechanical innovations drew particular attention from the delegation's engineering representatives. Michael and Matthew had developed modifications to farming equipment that increased efficiency while reducing costs, making modern agricultural techniques accessible to small-scale operations. "We've learned that innovation doesn't have to be expensive or complicated," Michael explained as he demonstrated a grain sorting device they had designed. "Sometimes the best solutions are the simplest ones, especially when you understand the real challenges people face in their daily work." Emma's presentation on financial management and cooperative economics prompted extended discussions about sustainable funding models for rural development. Her systematic approach to tracking program outcomes and calculating return on investment had provided the Institute with credibility that attracted support from unexpected sources. "The most important thing we've learned," Emma told the visitors, "is that helping people build sustainable livelihoods creates value for entire communities. When families become self-sufficient and productive, everyone benefits." James's educational innovations sparked particular interest among the delegation's academic representatives. His integration of practical skills training with traditional academic subjects had produced graduates who were equally prepared for university study or immediate productive work. "Education should expand possibilities, not limit them," James explained with the passion of a born teacher. "When young people master both intellectual and practical skills, they can choose their own paths based on their interests and aptitudes rather than being constrained by circumstances." Lucy's work with animals provided the day's most memorable moments. Her ability to calm and communicate with even the most difficult animals seemed almost magical to observers who hadn't witnessed it before. But more importantly, her success in teaching these skills to other children demonstrated that her gift could be shared and developed. "I don't really understand how it works," Lucy admitted to the fascinated visitors with the honesty that made her so effective with both animals and people. "I just listen to what they're trying to tell me and try to help them feel safe." As the day progressed, Elizabeth found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The Institute now served more than 300 families directly, with thousands more benefiting from the innovations and techniques they had developed. Their model was being studied and replicated throughout the American West, and they had received inquiries from organizations as far away as Europe and Australia. But beyond the numbers and the recognition, what mattered most was the transformation she saw in individual lives. Young people who had never imagined they could master complex skills now taught those skills to others. Families who had been on the verge of dissolution had rebuilt stronger relationships while developing economic stability. Communities that had been struggling with isolation and limited opportunities had become centers of innovation and mutual support. The evening brought the delegation's final presentations and discussions about potential collaboration between the Institute and Colorado's developing rural support programs. As Elizabeth listened to the animated conversations about expansion possibilities and partnership opportunities, she felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond personal achievement. "Elizabeth," Marcus said quietly as they stood together on the porch after the visitors had retired for the evening, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't ridden out into that storm?" Elizabeth considered the question seriously. So much of their current life seemed to depend on that single moment of decision, that inexplicable compulsion that had driven Marcus into the blizzard against all logic and reason. "I think," she said, finally, "that somehow we would have found each other anyway. Maybe not that night, maybe not in that way, but something would have brought us together. Some people are meant to build something meaningful together, and circumstances have a way of creating the opportunities they need." Marcus smiled, pulling her closer against the cool evening air. You think we were destined to create all this? I think we were destined to find each other, Elizabeth replied. Everything else grew from that foundation. The institute, the programs, the hundreds of families we've helped. All of it started with 8 people who learned that survival wasn't enough, that they wanted to build something beautiful together. As if summoned by their conversation, the children began gathering on the porch, drawn by the comfortable tradition of evening discussions that had begun during their earliest days at the ranch. Robert came from the barn, Sarah from the kitchen where she had been preparing tomorrow's meals, the twins from the workshop where they never seemed to stop inventing and improving, Emma from the office where she had been reviewing program evaluations, James from the library where he had been developing new curriculum materials, and Lucy from the animal hospital where she had been comforting an injured foal. How did the meetings go today? Robert asked, settling into the chair that had become his customary spot during these family conferences. Very well, Elizabeth replied. Colorado wants to establish 3 satellite operations based on our model. They're particularly interested in our approach to family-centered development. That would mean training more families to become program coordinators, Sarah observed thoughtfully. We'll need to expand our instructor development programs, and we'll need to adapt our equipment innovations for different geographic and climatic conditions, Michael added, his engineering mind immediately jumping to practical considerations. Plus developing region-specific financial models, Emma contributed. What works here in Wyoming might need modification for different economic environments. The educational components will need adaptation too, James said. Different states have different requirements and expectations for rural education. But the animals are the same everywhere, Lucy added, with the simple wisdom that often cuts straight to the heart of complex issues. They all need to feel safe and loved and understood. Elizabeth listened to her children, for she thought of them all as her children now, bound together by experience and choice rather than blood alone, and marveled at their maturity and insight. They had grown from desperate survivors into confident leaders, from recipients of charity into creators of opportunity for others. You know, Marcus said quietly, 5 years ago I thought success meant accumulating wealth and building a business empire. Now I understand that real success is measured by how many lives you can touch positively, how many people you can help discover their own potential. 5 years ago, Elizabeth added, I thought my greatest responsibility was keeping my children alive from one day to the next. Now I understand that the greatest gift we can give our children is the opportunity to contribute something meaningful to the world. The conversation continued late into the evening, covering plans for program expansion, discussions of innovation and improvement, and dreams for the future that seemed limitless in their scope and possibility. But underlying all the practical planning was a deeper recognition of how far they had all traveled, not just in terms of material success, but in their understanding of what really mattered in life. As the family finally began to disperse for the night, Elizabeth remained on the porch with Marcus, looking out over the ranch that had become so much more than either of them had ever imagined. Lights still burned in several of the Institute's buildings, where students and instructors worked on projects that would benefit families they might never meet. Do you think Daniel would approve? Elizabeth asked suddenly, surprising herself with the question. She rarely spoke of her first husband anymore, not because his memory had faded, but because his presence had become so naturally integrated into the life they had built. Marcus considered the question seriously. He had never met Daniel Carter, but he had learned to know him through Elizabeth's memories and through the values she had instilled in their children. I think, Marcus said carefully, that Daniel would be amazed by what you've accomplished. He dreamed of building something to pass down to his children. You've built something that will be passed down to hundreds of children for generations to come. Elizabeth felt tears prick her eyes, but they were tears of gratitude rather than grief. Daniel's dreams had indeed been fulfilled, just not in the way any of them could have anticipated. The homestead he had wanted to build had become something far grander, a foundation for hope and opportunity that reached far beyond anything one a family could have achieved alone. And Catherine? Elizabeth asked, mentioning Marcus's first wife with the same easy acceptance that had allowed them both to honor their past while building their future. Marcus smiled, thinking of the young woman who had followed him west with such courage and optimism. Catherine always believed that love multiplied rather than divided when it was shared generously. I think she would say, "We've proven her right beyond her wildest dreams." As they finally prepared to go inside, Elizabeth took one last look at the thriving community that had grown from the seeds of their desperate circumstances. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new families to help, new programs to develop. But tonight, surrounded by the evidence of what could be accomplished when people chose to support each other rather than simply compete, she felt the deep peace that comes from knowing your life has made a lasting difference. The blizzard that had nearly destroyed them had instead become the foundation for their greatest achievement. The desperate family that had almost perished in the snow had become the creators of hope for countless others facing their own storms. Love had indeed multiplied, just as Catherine had believed it would, and the legacy they were building together would continue to multiply, creating ripples of hope and opportunity that would reach far beyond their ability to imagine or measure. The story that had begun with survival had become a story of transformation, not just for one family, but for an entire region and all the families yet to come who would benefit from the truth they had discovered, that with proper support, genuine care, and the opportunity to contribute meaningfully to something larger than themselves, any family could not just survive but thrive beyond their wildest dreams. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.